Oh, hi, I'm a little bit country, and welcome to... Hello and welcome to Talk Horror to Me, the home of all things horror and all things sarcastic. Now, that's right, your drunk mum is going to rant about things. Today we are taking a drunken deep dive, into the Amityville house. Please make sure you are subscribed to the channel. I talk about horror films and the wider genre as a whole, and I upload whenever I'm not depression hibernating, so don't expect any sense of a regular upload schedule. You will be disappointed. Please consider following my other social medias. Peep my Insta and TikTok on the screen now. Numbers are the only way I feel any sort of validation in this crippling world we live in right now. That and alcohol, Jesus. Oh, let's get started with this deep dive into the hoax that was the Amityville Horror. Let's do a little bit of background first, because I don't know about you guys. I mentioned this briefly in my unpopular opinions about horror video. Watch that if you haven't already. I always thought when I was younger and first exposed to the Amityville Horror as a franchise and as a movie, I always believed it. 100%. The Amityville case, the hauntings of the Lutz family were 100% real, because that's how it's always presented. But as you grow up and you see more of those based on real events horror, or this is based on a true story, you gain a little perspective and you realise, oh, they're all just straight up lying to me. Great. I didn't think you were allowed to present straight up lies as facts, but apparently in horror we are allowed to do exactly that. But the original story goes like this. Ronald Defeo Jr. shot and killed his entire family when they lived in the Amityville house. That is a fact. That is a real multiple murder. Did indeed happen in that house in November of 1974. He shot Ronald Sr., his wife Louise, and the children were Dawn, who was aged 18 at the time, Allison, who was 13, Mark, who was 12, and John Matthew, who was 9. Ronald Defeo Jr. first presented the shootings as an alleged hitman entering the home, so that would then be placed into police custody, protecting him. Eventually, he couldn't keep up the pretense, of course, started admitting everything. And he even named the hitman, but the person that he named wasn't in the state at the time, so, you know, he had to kind of give up. Ronnie Jr. was, of course, arrested and was eventually charged with second-degree murder. There has been some air of controversy surrounding Ronnie's conviction, and he's been changing his story on the murders ever since the 70s. At one point, trying to pin the murders partially on his sister Dawn and his own mother, saying that she had murdered their father, and in response, Louise had snapped and killed all of his siblings, leaving Ronnie, who would then kill Louise. But as the police reports state, all victims were found in their bed, face down, with zero signs of struggle. So, I fail to see how this version of events would ever have made sense, but go off Ronnie. And also, at the time of his arrest, he very quickly was asking the authorities what he had to do to collect the life insurance money for his family. Your motives were not lost on us, Ronnie. Jump forward to 1990, and he filed a 440 motion to have his conviction vacated on the grounds that Dawn, his dead sister, and an unknown assailant killed their parents. And after this unknown killer fled, Dawn killed their siblings, and whilst Ronnie and Dawn struggled over the gun, he accidentally shot and killed his sister. And he's done various interviews in the wake of his conviction, stating a whole load of different retellings. He doesn't seem to be a credible source for the truth anyway. These were mostly the facts of the murders that took place at the infamous 112 Ocean Avenue, which is located on Long Island. Here's where the paranormal haunting shit comes into play. Just over a year after the murders took place, George and Kathy Lutz, along with their 3 children, moved into the Amityville house. This was in December of 1975, and they would leave after just 28 days, claiming to have been terrorized by paranormal phenomenon. I'm going to delve into the plot of the original book now, as that is the source material for most of the subsequent films. So here is the plot summary of the book, The Amityville Horror, published in 1977 by Jay Anson. The book immediately reports to be based on a true story, of course, and it speaks of 112 Ocean Avenue remaining empty for 13 months after the Defeo murders. I'm getting distracted by blocking people on TikTok. Then George and Kathy bought the house at the bargain price of $80,000. I know this is a murder house and I know it's haunted and all that, blah, 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 but look at this fucking house. Are you kidding? I know it was the 70s as well, but $80,000? Ugh. I'd happily buy a murder house if it meant it was cheap. 100% I would do that. It was a 5-bed Dutch colonial style house with those infamous upper windows. It kind of makes it look like the house has eyes peering into your soul. Love it. It also has a swimming pool, a boathouse. It's fucking sick. 19 out of 10 would fucking live in this house. They did know of the murders when initially purchasing the property, but they decided, like, there was no problem. Move forward. Fuck it. Murder house. When they moved in, all of the furniture from the Defeo family was still there, and they were allowed to keep it if they just fronted $400. They were allowed to keep every single bit of furniture in the house. That wouldn't happen nowadays. It would be a selling point and therefore a way to bump up the price. If something fucking cool like something cool like multiple murders happened. I'm such a piece of garbage. They moved in on December the 19th, 1975. One of George's friends had learnt of the history of the Amityville house and was like, boy, get the house blessed. But he knew of a Catholic priest that would come and perform the blessing. This priest was referred to as Father Mancuso in the book for privacy reasons. It's an alias, but has since been named as Father Ralph J. Pecoraro. We'll call him Ralph. He was a lawyer, a Catholic, a court judge, and a psychotherapist. As he started the ritual and sprayed the first bit of holy water and began to pray, he heard a masculine voice demand that he get out. He didn't mention this to George or Kathy, but he did call the family on Christmas Eve. He advised them to stay out of the second floor room where he had heard that voice. You know, we just bought this house. We're going to live here. This is potentially our forever home, but there's one room in the house. We're not allowed to go into it all because a priest told us not to. Sense was made. No. That was apparently the former bedroom of little Mark and John William Defeo. Kathy had been planning to use that room as a sewing room, but maybe instead we stay out of the murder bedroom. I don't know. Can you not do your sewing in the living room, bitch? Apparently when Father Ralph was on the phone to Kathy to warn her about the room, the call just cut to static and eventually just disconnected completely. And he said he allegedly developed blisters on his hands akin to stigmata immediately after the call. You know, stigmata, like the wounds of Christ. At first, George and Kathy didn't experience anything unusual, of course. But by mid-January of 1976, after another blessing, or attempted blessing, they experienced what would be their final night in the Amityville house. At the time, they declined to give any statements about what happened, describing the details as too frightening. So they contacted Father Ralph. They took minimal belongings to Kathy's mother's house, but they also claimed that the phenomenon followed them there as well, with the final scene of the book describing greenish black slime coming out of the stairs towards them. They had left the Amityville house on January 14th, 1976, leaving most of their belongings behind as well. And when a mover showed up to collect the rest of their things, he of course reported to experience paranormal events whilst inside the famous Amityville house. Obviously! The murder house. Ugh. The book was written after the Lutzes were introduced to Jay Anson. Whilst George and Kathy didn't directly work with Jay, they submitted over 40 hours of taped testimony, and they were used as the basis for the book. Now, let's talk about the subsequent controversy surrounding the book that came out after its release. Father Ralph was pissed. He was outed as the book's real-life Father Mancuso, and he stated that the only contact he'd actually ever had with the Lutzes was over the telephone. So these blessings and hearing shit in the house didn't happen because they'd never met in person. This was stated in an affidavit on record. But then there are other sources that state that he did go to the house, but he didn't experience any paranormal goings on. He just performed a blessing as normal. But he says, I didn't meet this fucking family. So they wrote about me in their book as if I'd been in that house and heard the devil, and I fucking didn't. But it's clear to see that that was the real reason that his identity was omitted from the book. Because they were lying! Future owners of the house would contest the physical damage to the house caused by these hauntings. So a couple named Jim and Barbara Cromitty bought the same house for $55,000 in March of 77. They claimed that they still had the original locks, doors, and windows, whereas the book claimed that all of these were mysteriously broken when ghosts were wreaking havoc, you know? There was also a claim of cloven hoof prints in the snow by, you know, demon hoofs, you know, demon animals. And that was in early January of 1976. And this was rejected by simple fucking researchers who noted there was no fucking snow in Amityville at that time. This is easily debunked. If they tried to make these claims now, all we'd be doing as armchair detectives was Googling it and going, didn't happen. Fuck. Didn't happen. There's a picture of Amityville. There's a picture of the house on that fucking day. Where's the snow, bitch? Where's your cloven hoof prints, bitch? I need to calm down. And whilst police officers are depicted in the book and in the subsequent films, there's a bunch of like police activity because the Lutzes are all scared. There were no phone calls to the police from 112 Ocean Avenue at the time and the 28 days that the Lutzes were living there. The Lutzes didn't call the police whilst they were living at 112 Ocean Avenue. There would be fucking evidence of that. Didn't happen. Critics have also pointed out that details of the books were changed as it was reprinted for different editions. It's like they received criticism and alleged debunking of the things in their book, so when they re-released it, they would just change those bits. It's real benign things. So it makes it seem really sketchy that you would change it. In the original book, Father Ralph's car was a old tan Ford, but then in future editions it's a Chevrolet Vega, and then suddenly in later editions it's a Ford again. So in May of 1977, the Lutz family actually filed a lawsuit against William, is it Weber or Weber? Because it's got one B. A guy called William. And William defended Ronald Defeo Jr. at his trial. I don't know what the Lutzes thought it had to do with them, but okay, sue him. Honestly, Americans just think they can fucking sue anyone for anything. This lawsuit also served a man called Paul Hoffman, who was a writer working on his own account of the alleged hauntings. It also served a guy named Bernard Burton, Frederick Mars, who are both supposed clairvoyants, who had examined the house, along with Good Housekeeping magazine, the New York Sunday News, and the Hearst Corporation, who had all printed articles about the hauntings. That's a lot of suing. Kathy and George sued so many people. I don't think you can really sue massive news reporting medias reporting on the contents of a widely published book. So that was stupid to begin with, and clearly just an attempt to extort the most money because the news outlets are going to have the most money, you know? I've just realised I've been looking at the viewfinder for ages, I'm sorry. I'm vain and a little bit drunk, you know? Of the things that were completely thrown out for lack of evidence, the remaining lawsuit was heard in 79, and a judge dismissed the claims, stating as followed. Based on what I've heard, it appears to me that to a large extent the book is a work of fiction, relying in a large part upon the suggestions of Mr. Weber. In a September 1979 issue of People magazine, Weber said the following: I know this book is a hoax. We created this horror story over many bottles of wine. Ah, there it is! The judge was pretty concerned about how Burton and Weber conducted themselves regarding this situation, being that they're a part of a respected field, they're professionals, and it brought up some serious ethical questions, like when lawyers decide to become literary agents. Like, he defended Ronald Defeo Jr. and then subsequently came up with the haunting hoax with the family within a couple of years. It just screams of, it's just inappropriate, isn't it? Ooh. But George Lutz would continue to maintain that the events outlined in the book were mostly true and denied any dishonesty on his part. I wasn't going to include this, but I suppose it's interesting to note that the Lutzes did take polygraph tests in 1979. One, polygraphs are widely discredited nowadays. They're controversial and they cannot be entered as evidence into any court of law because of the inaccuracy that surrounds them. This is over 40 years ago, where I don't imagine that the technology was much past its infancy, but they were deemed to be not deceptive when talking about the events that happened in 112 Ocean Avenue. I mentioned earlier that the owners who bought the house after George and Kathy left were a couple, and the husband, who was called James, said nothing weird ever happened there. And the only strange goings on were the people coming by my house because of the book and the movies. They lived in that house for 10 years. So that is mostly the history regarding the Amityville Horror and the events surrounding the supposed true story. I'll state my explicit thoughts on the case now before we get into the movies. These hauntings didn't fucking happen. No, they didn't. And there's no way you are telling me that they did. They created an elaborate story, which was a dope idea for a film.
It has stood empty for a long while. And at the price, it is a bargain. For a growing young family, it is almost too good to be true.
What do you think?
I love it.
In the Amityville Horror.
God's peace in this house.
They decided to add the extra spice of convincing people that it actually happened to attract more media, more hysteria, and they used the Defeo murders as a basis for a demon living in that house, possessing the people who lived there. It was convenient and it was clever, but that doesn't mean it was fucking true. The book and the events at 112 Ocean Avenue has spawned 20 film adaptions. I'm going to discuss a few of the more popular titles that achieved like mainstream popularity, because a bunch of these are just titles that looked like they were made for maybe a couple of $1,000s for a school project.
I heard Mia went to the Amity house on a dare, but that was weeks ago and no one's seen her since.
That's a lie, Sally, and you know it.
That used Amityville as a basis because they couldn't think of anything original. It's like what American Poltergeist did with the fucking Lizzie Borden story, you know? Just out of nowhere because it's popular.
Who's Lizzie Borden?
Give her a break. She's a West Coast girl.
No! I thought when they said that Taryn's real last name was Borden, that it was some kind of weird homage. Are they really making this about Lizzie fucking Borden? The most popular title that capitalized on being released pretty quickly after the book was the original Amityville Horror, released in 1979, starring James Brolin and Margot Kidder as George and Kathy Lutz. It was a major success, returning $86 million on a budget of less than $5 million. It's become cult in its history, but it's really bad. It's really badly reviewed because it's a really bad film. It's just boring, and because it's a 70s film depicting the paranormal, nothing fucking happens. This film was directly remade in 2005, which I think is a much better watch, but it deviates even further from the book into ridiculous territory, but we'll get to that in good fucking time. Amityville 2: The Possession is a prequel to the events that George and Kathy experienced, this time starring the Montelli family, based on the real-life Defeo family. There is also a direct remake of this one released in 2018, which we will talk about, but first, let's get this dumpster fire out of the way. The film brings a new facet to this story, showing the audience that the house has a secret tunnel in the basement, leading into the house from somewhere unknown, which I don't think was ever reported on in the Amityville house. But nice. Creative license, I guess. There's Daddy Anthony, the mother named Dolores, and the kids, Sunny, Patricia, Mark, and Jan. They start to feel an increasingly dark, evil presence throughout the house, with paranormal occurrences going on more and more.
What's happening to us?
Bibles get torn to pieces, scary messages written on the wall. Sunny himself starts to become more sinister and demonic, and it's even scaring him. So he barricades himself away from his family, but of course is unsuccessful due to the demon inside of him. And one night, the evil spirit tells Sunny to kill them all, and he shoots his parents and siblings. And after the bodies are picked up, Sunny is discovered to be possessed, and there's an illegal exorcism performed.
If you can hear me, resist the unclean spirit.
You've decided to do this on your own, without the support of the church. You are disobeying the church.
But the demon is transferred into the priest, and the police take Sunny away. Look, I haven't seen this film, and I don't want to now. It looks fucking dumb. And no one likes it either. It holds 11% on Rotten Tomatoes, and apparently there was just excessive use of effects that looked really bad, and a very boring storyline. According to one critic, this was an embarrassing attempt to capitalize on the success of Amityville Horror. As were the preceding 17 adaptions as well, but you know, we'll get to them. I'm not really going to talk about the next few adaptions in the timeline because most of them are just fictionalized stories that use the Amityville house as a set. I guess it's a way to boost the atmosphere of their paranormal film. Standard paranormal film, put it in the Amityville house. That's these people's thought process. What we will talk about is the direct remake of the original, starring Ryan Reynolds. And as much as it's a direct remake, there's a lot of new shit thrust into there. Young Chloe Grace Moritz is one of the Lutz children in this film, and she befriends an imaginary girl named Jodie, who is presented as the youngest murdered Defeo child.
What's wrong, Ronnie?
I love you, Jodie.
But a cursory Google search will tell you that the youngest Defeo child was a boy named John William, who was 9. I guess girls are creepier than boys, you know? Then this subplot is introduced. Unless it was used in any way in the weird sequels we haven't talked about, this is the first instance of this explanation. And none of the research I did regarding the facts of the real life murder include this either. And Kathy decides to do some of her own research on the house's history and the reasons why it might be haunted. She discovers the house once belonged to a cult preacher named Jeremiah Ketchum, who tortured and killed Native Americans during the 17th century. And that is apparently the cause of the demonic possession and the evil spirits in the Amityville house. And as George Lutz is becoming more and more possessed to harm his own family, he's seeing apparitions of these tortured Native Americans, and Kathy figures out that the spirit of Jeremiah Ketchum is possessing George and is intent on having him kill his own family, just as he did to Ronald Defeo Jr. to kill his family. Father Calloway tells her, just get him away from the house. It's the house that's the problem. It's the land that's haunted. Then the ending kind of plays out the same.
Don't even look at it, Kathy. Let's get out of here.
They leave the property and Ryan Reynolds is released from the curse of Jeremiah Ketchum. There was some really corny ADR of some paranormal voices who would say, Ketchum, kill him. Like catch them, but Ketchum. It was stupid. I think the most frustrating part of this situation is the way that it's presented by its inceptors as true and a real tragedy that has happened to them. And then in this film, it's just completely rooted in creative license. Like, if you're gonna make a paranormal movie, fine. I love a paranormal movie. But why are you trying to root it in the fact by keeping the bare bones of a 25-year-old book that was already debunked at this point, but you don't really use any of the facts that were presented in that book, and you just make all of your own shit up. But you still tack based on the true story on the poster and in all the advertisement when it's not. Jeremiah Ketchum is not a real person, and the person he's possibly based on has nothing to do with the events that are presented in this remake. What they may be referring to is John Ketchum. The spelling of that name is up for debate due to like translations and it's Ketchum or Ketchum. He settled in Amityville after having been cast out of Salem for practicing witchcraft, and is alleged to have set up home on the Amityville land, or at least within 500 feet of the property line. He's alleged to have been a devil worshipper, but what does that really mean in 17th century America versus nowadays? Women were called witches for knowing how to read, so make of that what you will. Next, I'm going to talk about Amityville The Awakening. It makes its own original, even worse mistakes. The family moves to the Amityville house, and one of the children is brain dead. And that child in this film, this film stars Bella Thorne, but unfortunately, she's not playing herself. She's not the child that's brain dead. The reason given for moving to this Amityville house was because they would be closer to a very specialist neurologist for the brain-dead son called James. The little sister of the family is named Juliet, and I didn't learn Bella Thorne's character name because she's Bella Thorne. So she's not acting, she's just being Bella Thorne in this film because we know she can't act. And Juliet tells Bella Thorne that James has been talking to her lately. Then he inexplicably opens his eyes later on that night.
He's talking to us through the computer. It's amazing. Come see.
So he's been brain dead. We've been keeping him alive to hope that someday this would happen, and they move to the Amityville house and he wakes up. Bella Thorne goes to her new school where they tease her for living in a murder house, which is a strange thing to bully someone over, but okay. I would be like, you live in the murder house? Can I come over? Can I come over for dinner? I'll bring wine. We can chill in the murder house. She didn't know of the Defeo murders before moving in, so she learns of that at school. And then when she goes home, she discovers a blood stain underneath her wallpaper in her room. Spooky. Other spooky things happen. Things turn off at 3:15 a.m., which was supposed to be the time that the Defeo murders happened. Flies fill the room, a bunch of other overused paranormal tropes as well. It turns out that James's body is just being possessed. I didn't care to research which demon was possessing James. Was it Ronnie Defeo Jr.? Was it Jeremiah Ketchum? Was it the spirit of Anna Nicole Smith? We will never know. The climax of this movie involves James shooting his mother.
Oh God, no.
God has nothing to do with this.
Damn you to hell!
And then immediately reverts back to his paralyzed state. And he immediately dies because he's detached from all his medical equipment like he has been for weeks. So if it looks a little different, my camera died and then my SD card was full. So I had to do all that. So I'm significantly drunker than I was when I stopped filming. Oh, what video am I filming? And of course, because he's not hooked up to any medical equipment anymore, he dies instantly. Bella Thorne is arrested for all the murders, but of course she says, look, James was the shooter. Believe me, I'm Bella Thorne, bitch.
Police are questioning 17-year-old Belle Walker as a person of interest in the brutal murders of her Aunt Candace, her mother Joan, and the death of her brother James. Miss Walker claims that her brother committed the crimes, and her story has been corroborated by her 7-year-old sister, Juliet. A spokesman for the Amityville Police Department said that forensic evidence does point to James as the killer. His fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. But Dr. Ken Milton refutes that claim, stating that James Walker was too weak to get out of bed, let alone stalk his entire family with a shotgun.
That's the movie. Why? Why was that film? Why for that film? Amityville is a widely known phenomenon that attracts attention, and honestly, if you can make a movie about it and present it to a wider distribution service and get it in theaters, it's bound to make money. Little to no creativity went into this, and it fucking shows. But the film did run into a lot of red tape in its production. It was scheduled for a January 2015 release, but that didn't happen. Then, due to the Weinstein allegations and the fall of Miramax Pictures, this film was kind of passed around before eventually being released for free on Google Play, and that was in the October of 2017. It has 30% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is a bit annoying for me because it legitimizes this film in critic peer reviews over the 2005 remake of the original, which is a much better film. It is. I think that's massively inappropriate considering this film's lack of originality. Okay, lastly, we're gonna discuss the second remake in this series, which was that one I talked about earlier. The Amityville Murders 2018 is based on the Amityville prequel surrounding the Defeo murders. It's not widely discussed, but the reviews for this film are so angry in tone. All the reviewers seem to be so pressed about the fact that this film even exists. This culminates in a Rotten Tomatoes score of 6%. It appears to be an incredibly boring regurgitation of Amityville 2: The Possession. This film series and the nature surrounding it has stayed in pop culture ever since the events of 1974. We are approaching 50 years of the history of Amityville. And whilst I do appreciate the phenomena and the chance to research all these historical events, I just can't get over how staunchly people tried to convince the public that this was a real haunting that happened because of the Defeo murders. It just slaps of distaste and the mercenary need to make money off of real life murders. People actually fucking died because of what Ronald Defeo Jr. did to them, and it's spawned 20 films profiting off of the murders, because what happened to George and Kathy didn't happen. It wasn't real. So they're profiting directly off of Ronald Defeo Jr.'s crime. I really don't know what George and Kathy and like the Lutz family do now, and I don't really want to know, because clearly fame and recognition from this case was all they were after. The bare minimum that we need to know about the Lutzes is at the most they were criminal fraudsters, and at the very least they were fucking weird liars. I loved this research project, you guys. I can't tell you how fun this was. I spent 6+ hours in my bed on a Sunday morning researching all of this. Hell yeah. I have a lot more deep dives scripted already that I just need to film, and any suggestions of topics that you think would make a good deep dive, throw them in the comments below. But that's it from me today, kids. Please make sure you are subscribed for semi-regular, irregular horror content. Drop a skull and crossbones emoji in the comments below, and like the video if you made it this far. That's it from me today, kids, and I'll be back.